I'm going to step away from the Farm Bill and from Washington for a second and address a particularly interesting state-level election result from last week, namely the defeat by voters in California of Proposition 37 by a 53 to 47% margin. This was a ballot issue that would have mandated labels on all foods with genetically engineered ingredients. We've seen ballot issues of this kind before. Several years ago, a similar measure was defeated in Oregon, although that was defeated by a 70 to 30 margin, not a 53 to 47 margin. And in California, the defeat came only after some $46 million of mostly industry money was spent beating back the proposition. So this is a tide that may not be receding. Because this measure failed, however, the United States still will have no labeling requirements for genetically engineered foods anywhere, in contrast to between 30 and 50 other countries abroad that have adopted labeling requirements. Now, in the U.S., the Food and Drug Administration has always opposed mandatory labeling for foods with genetically engineered ingredients in the belief that labeling requirements should be reserved for things that consumers need to know, not just things that consumers might be curious about. And I think technically that's a sound position. But California is a big market, and if this ballot measure had passed, and if it had not been struck down in the federal courts, and we won't know the answer to that question, a similar mandatory labeling for RBST milk was struck down by the federal courts some years ago. But if it had passed, if it had not been struck down, food companies in the United States that were worried about adverse consumer reactions to a genetically engineered label might have begun voluntarily reformulating their products away from genetically engineered ingredients in order to avoid the stigmatizing label. And this was the intent, actually, of some proponents of Prop 37. It wasn't to give consumers a choice between genetically engineered and not genetically engineered. It was to drive genetically engineered foods out of the market completely. But what I find remarkable, thinking about it, is the extent to which genetically engineered foods have already been driven out of the market, even without any requirement for mandatory labels. It's often noted that 70% of purchased packaged foods in the United States have some genetically engineered ingredients, and that's true, but these ingredients are mostly byproducts like oils or starch or sweeteners from genetically engineered crops like soybeans or corn that have been processed for animal feed. Our big three genetically engineered crops are not primarily crops for human food use. They are soy, corn, and cotton. And 98% of our soybean crop goes for animal feed. 88% of our corn crop goes for animal feed, or it's processed for ethanol. And of course, cotton is primarily an industrial crop. As for our food crops in the United States, like wheat, rice, and potatoes, we have voluntarily decided not to plant genetically engineered varieties of these crops. No wheat, no rice. We planted genetically engineered potatoes in the late 1990s, but then that product was withdrawn from commercial cultivation when fast food chains told their suppliers that they didn't want to be accused of selling genetically engineered French fries. As for fruits, the only genetically engineered fruit crop we grow now is papaya on about 1,000 acres in Hawaii. As for vegetables, we used to grow genetically engineered tomatoes on 25,000 acres back in the late 1990s, but that was withdrawn, once again, in response to consumer anxieties. Now we produce just a little bit of genetically engineered zucchini and summer squash. As for animal products like meat, milk, and eggs, even if the animals have been fed genetically engineered feed, these products are not considered or labeled as genetically engineered, even in the European Union. So to a surprising extent, even in the United States, which is the world's leading grower of genetically engineered crops, we've kept our foods for direct human consumption largely free from genetically engineered crops. So if Prop 37 had passed, and if our food companies had decided to reformulate entirely away from things like oils or sweeteners from genetically engineered crops, it would have been costly, but it would not have been impossible. If they'd sought to avoid the GE label by taking those steps, they could have done so. But this, in a sense, for me, is symptomatic of the problem. It seems that even without mandatory labels, the anti-GM advocacy community has now so successfully stigmatized genetically engineered crops over the last 18 years as to have marginalized their use in foods for direct human consumption. We're moving toward a new norm now, even in the United States, where genetically engineered crops are widely grown and used for industrial purposes and for animal feed purposes, but only marginally for direct human consumption. Now, I can understand the anxieties that activists felt 18 years ago when these crops were first placed on the market. They were brand new, and the tests that had been done for their safety weren't trusted by many people. But now, nearly 2 decades later, after a history of safe use, you would think that the advocates against this technology would start to adjust their perspective, and yet they have not. Now, the reason this is important is if it becomes a new norm, even in the United States, to accept this technology for industrial use and for feed use, but only marginally for direct human consumption, that will drive research money away from improving food crops with genetic engineering. It will reinforce tendencies in other countries to use mandatory labels and regulatory restrictions to keep genetically food crops out of the market, and that will make needlessly more difficult the task of feeding 9 billion people around the world by the year 2050. In the United States, we can run a pretty prosperous agricultural system by investing heavily in crop farming for feed and industrial purposes and a livestock industry based on some of those crops. But in most of the developing world, the sector of crop farming that's in most urgent need of a productivity upgrade is the food crop sector. And if the United States drifts into a posture of not using genetically engineered foods in its own food crop sector, that will make it more difficult to communicate to other countries that this is an option that is available to them and one in which they should take an interest.